Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel No Filter Global. Today, we are going to talk about Thanksgiving. When you think about the history of Thanksgiving, what image pops into your head? If you grew up in the United States, you probably picture a very specific scene. You see pilgrims wearing tall black hats with buckles on them. You see Native Americans wearing feathers. They are sitting around a big wooden table outside, sharing a giant roasted turkey. Everyone is smiling, shaking hands, and being best friends. It's a beautiful story about different cultures coming together in peace. It's the story we are taught in elementary school plays and children's books. It makes us feel warm and fuzzy inside. It suggests that the founding of America started with a friendly dinner party. But here is the hard truth. That picture in your head is mostly a myth. It's a fairy tale that was created much later. The real history of what happened in Plymouth in 1621 and what happened afterward is much more complicated, much less happy, and a lot bloodier. Today, we are going to peel back the layers of this myth and look at what really happened between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people. Before we talk about the dinner, we need to understand who was actually there. It wasn't just Pilgrims and Indians. Let's start with the Native Americans. The group of people living in the area where the Pilgrims landed were the Wampanoag. It's really important to know that they weren't just wandering around the woods. They had been living there for thousands of years. They had their own towns, their own government, their own politics, and their own enemies. But right before the Pilgrims arrived, the Wampanoag went through a massive tragedy. European explorers who came before the Pilgrims had brought diseases. These sicknesses wiped out a huge number of Wampanoag people. Some historians say up to 90% of their coastal population died just a few years earlier. So, when the Pilgrims showed up, the Wampanoag were already dealing with great sadness and a broken society. Then you have the Pilgrims. They arrived on the Mayflower in 1620. They were religious people looking for a place to practice their faith freely, but they were also completely unprepared for life in a new land. They arrived right before winter. They didn't know how to farm in this soil. They didn't know what to eat. That first winter was brutal. About half of the 102 people on the Mayflower died of starvation and sickness. The only reason the rest survived was that they robbed Wampanoag graves and food storage pits to find corn. They were desperate, terrified, and they needed help. Okay, so let's get to the famous dinner in the autumn of 1621. This is the event we base Thanksgiving on. The remaining Pilgrims had finally managed to grow a good harvest, thanks mostly to help from a Wampanoag man named Squanto, who you might know as Squanto. He taught them how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer. The Pilgrims decided to have a harvest festival to celebrate the fact that they weren't going to starve that winter. It wasn't called Thanksgiving back then. To them, a Thanksgiving was a solemn day of prayer, not a party. This was just a harvest celebration, something common in England. They fired their guns into the air to celebrate. Here is where the myth gets murky. The Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, heard the gunshots. He didn't think, "Oh good, a party." He thought the Pilgrims were being attacked, or maybe that the Pilgrims were attacking his people. So, Massasoit showed up with about 90 warriors, fully armed, ready for trouble. They found it was just a harvest party. But now you had 90 hungry warriors arriving as guests. The Pilgrims didn't have enough food for everyone. So, the Wampanoag men went out and hunted 5 deer and brought them back as a gift. They ended up staying for 3 days. Did they eat together? Did they play games? Probably. Was it a happy, friendly meal that symbolized eternal peace? Not exactly. It was more like a tense political meeting. The Wampanoag and the Pilgrims had made an alliance, a deal to protect each other. But they didn't fully trust each other. The Wampanoag helped the Pilgrims because they needed allies against their own rival native groups. The Pilgrims needed the Wampanoag just to stay alive. The feast wasn't about friendship, It was about survival and politics. And what did they eat? Definitely deer. Probably lots of seafood like lobster, clams, and eel. They had corn and local vegetables. They did have wild turkeys in the area, so maybe they ate turkey, but it wasn't the main dish. And they definitely didn't have pumpkin pie or cranberry sauce, because they didn't have sugar or ovens for baking. If history stopped right there in 1621, maybe the happy myth would be true. But history didn't stop. The years that followed were incredibly dark. The peace treaty between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims lasted for about 50 years, while Massasoit was alive. But during that time, thousands and thousands more English people arrived. They didn't need the Wampanoag's help anymore. They just wanted their land. The English settlers kept pushing the native people off their territory. They let their cows destroy native farm fields. They treated the native people as inferior. The tension got so bad that it eventually exploded into war. In 1637, just 16 years after the first feast, a different conflict called the Pequot War occurred. English soldiers surrounded a Pequot village and burned it to the ground, killing hundreds of men, women, and children. The English governor actually declared a Day of Thanksgiving to celebrate this massacre. That is a very different kind of Thanksgiving than the one we picture. Later, in 1675, a massive war broke out between the Wampanoag and the settlers, known as King Philip's War. King Philip was the name the English gave to Massasoit's son, Metacomet. It was a devastating, bloody war. In the end, the Wampanoag lost. Metacomet was killed, and his head was put on a spike in Plymouth town square, where it stayed for over 20 years. Many of the remaining Wampanoag people were sold into slavery and sent to the Caribbean. So, the real story that started with a tentative dinner ended with genocide and displacement. So if the real history is so grim, where did our happy holiday come from? For a long time, Thanksgiving wasn't a national holiday. Different states celebrated it on different days. The modern holiday was really invented in the mid-1800s. A woman named Sarah Josepha Hale, she actually wrote the song "Mary Had a Little Lamb," campaigned for decades to create a national day of thanks. She finally convinced President Abraham Lincoln in 1863. Think about what was happening in 1863. The Civil War. The country was torn apart, brother fighting brother. Lincoln needed something to unite the country. He established Thanksgiving as a national holiday to try to heal the divided nation. Later, long after the Civil War, storybooks and school curriculums started focusing on the 1621 dinner. They left out the blood and the betrayal. They created a simple, happy story about pilgrims and Indians getting along. This story made Americans feel good about their history. It made the takeover of native land seem peaceful and predestined, rather than violent. The myth was created to make us feel comfortable. So, should we stop celebrating Thanksgiving? No, that's not the point. It is a wonderful thing to gather with family and share gratitude. We need days like that. But we also need to tell the truth. When we repeat the myth of the happy meal, we are erasing the actual history and suffering of indigenous people. For many Native Americans today, Thanksgiving is not a day of celebration. It is a national day of mourning, a day to remember the land and lives that were lost. The best way to celebrate is to enjoy the food and family, but also to take a moment to educate ourselves about the real history and acknowledge the Wampanoag people who are still here today. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. See you next time.